I'm Rachel Maddow. Tonight we begin with a decision that Pentagon officials had anticipated, prepared for, and finally confirmed. A weapons announcement that unfolded not over months of deliberation, not over weeks of diplomatic back and forth, but in a matter of hours. Hours that sent shockwaves through the halls of the Kremlin. Hours that fundamentally changed the calculus on the battlefield. Hours that signaled a dramatic and potentially irreversible shift in American foreign policy. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Washington had long hoped would hold, a line that diplomats had quietly warned Moscow not to approach, a line that military planners had been preparing contingencies for since the earliest days of this conflict. And when that line finally broke, when Moscow made its move, Ukraine did not hesitate for even a moment. They responded with speed that caught even their allies off guard. They responded with precision that demonstrated months of careful preparation. And they responded with unmistakable resolve that sent a clear message to the world about what kind of nation they have become. For weeks now, there had been signals coming out of Washington. Not official White House statements, not Pentagon press releases or State Department briefings, just signals. The kind of signals that intelligence analysts and military observers learn to recognize over years of careful study, the kind of signals that suggest something unprecedented is being prepared behind closed doors. The Biden administration has been cautious throughout this conflict, yes. Critics have called them slow, hesitant, even timid at times. But those who understand how Washington operates know that this administration has been deliberate in their caution. Every weapon system delivered to Ukraine has followed a certain logic, a certain pattern, almost a rhythm that experienced observers could predict. First comes the debate, then comes the hesitation, then comes the announcement that the weapon is being considered, then more debate, and finally, delivery. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern went completely silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor U.S. military logistics for a living know the indicators that precede a major policy shift. They watch for transport flights to Ramstein Air Base in Germany increasing beyond normal operational tempo. They monitor encrypted communications between Kyiv and Washington for any unusual spikes in activity. They track sudden upticks in congressional briefings, particularly those involving the intelligence committees and armed services committees. They note when key officials suddenly disappear from public schedules without explanation. Over the past 2 weeks, all of these indicators appeared in sequence. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, all of them went quiet. The flights continued, but at reduced rates. The communications returned to baseline levels. The briefings ended. The officials reappeared at routine events. To the untrained eye, it looked like whatever had been planned had been canceled or postponed. But experienced observers knew better. Whenever Washington goes this quiet, it means something very loud is about to happen. Early Tuesday morning, U.S. European Command detected what they described in classified communications as a significant escalation in Russian missile activity along the Ukrainian border and within occupied territories. Satellite imagery showed the repositioning of Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile batteries to forward positions they had not occupied in over 8 months. These movements were not subtle. They were not designed to be hidden. Russia wanted NATO to see them. These are the kinds of strategic assets that Moscow only deploys in such visible fashion when they are signaling something very specific to their adversaries: escalation, intimidation, or preparation for a major offensive operation. NATO observers monitoring these movements in real time from facilities across Europe didn't know which category this fell into. Some argued it was pure intimidation, designed to frighten European capitals into pressuring Kyiv toward negotiations. Others believed it was preparation for a spring offensive that intelligence agencies had been warning about for months. Still others worried it might be all three at once, a coordinated campaign of military positioning and political pressure. But what every analyst agreed upon was that the Kremlin was fundamentally changing its posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts its military posture without explanation or diplomatic warning, the Pentagon pays very close attention. What happened next would change the trajectory of this entire war. Within hours of the Russian repositioning being confirmed, the United States government announced the immediate delivery of ATAC-M's long-range tactical missiles to Ukraine. Not the shorter-range variant that had been discussed for months. not a modified package with reduced capabilities or usage restrictions. The full system, the variant that Ukraine had been desperately requesting for over a year, the weapon that Pentagon officials had repeatedly said was too escalatory to provide, 300-kilometer range, capable of striking targets deep behind Russian lines, cluster munition warheads designed to destroy dispersed military assets across wide areas, GPS-guided precision that allows strikes accurate to within meters of their intended targets. This was the weapon that could reach every Russian command post in occupied Ukraine, every ammunition depot, every logistics hub, every airfield, and perhaps most significantly, every military installation in Crimea, the peninsula, Russia illegally annexed in 2014 and has since transformed into a fortress. The warning issued by the Kremlin in response was immediate and visceral. This was not the routine diplomatic protest that accompanies most Western arms deliveries. This was not the symbolic condemnation designed for domestic Russian audiences. This was not the measured response of a government confident in its position. This was panicked. Russian officials, speaking both publicly and through diplomatic channels, described America's decision in the harshest possible terms. They called it provocative. They called it a direct escalation of the conflict. They called it crossing a red line that would have consequences. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova warned of catastrophic results. Former President Dmitry Medvedev, who has become the Kremlin's voice for its most extreme threats, spoke of nuclear retaliation. State television hosts, who often signal the thinking of the Russian leadership, described the decision as an act of war against Russia itself. But threats only work if the target hesitates, if the target shows fear, if the target backs down. Ukraine did none of these things. Within 72 hours of receiving the first ATACMS shipment, before Russian forces could adapt their positioning or relocate vulnerable assets, Ukraine launched its first strikes using the new weapons. These weren't the standard HIMARS rocket attacks that have become a regular feature of this war. Those weapons, while effective, have limited range and are primarily useful for striking targets in the immediate rear of Russian lines. These were theater-level ballistic missiles, strategic weapons that Kyiv had never before possessed, weapons that fundamentally alter what Ukraine can threaten, weapons that Russia had specifically warned would be met with massive retaliation. Ukraine deployed them without hesitation, targeting military installations that had previously been beyond their reach, assets that Russia had considered safe from Ukrainian strikes. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed precision strikes on 9 separate Russian military targets in a single coordinated operation. The primary target was a major airfield in occupied Luhansk that had recently undergone significant upgrades. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western intelligence agencies showed the construction of new hardened aircraft shelters, reinforced structures designed to protect aircraft from drone attacks and artillery. Intelligence assessments concluded that these shelters were housing Russian attack helicopters and Su-34 fighter-bomber aircraft, platforms that have been responsible for devastating glide bomb attacks on Ukrainian cities. Russia was clearly preparing to expand air operations from this facility, potentially in preparation for the anticipated spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse those assets. The strikes were comprehensive and methodical, demonstrating careful planning and excellent intelligence. Ukrainian missiles hit the main runway, cratering it in multiple locations and rendering it temporarily unusable for fixed-wing aircraft. They hit the fuel depot, igniting fires that burned for hours and destroyed thousands of tons of aviation fuel that would have powered weeks of air operations. They hit the maintenance hangars where aircraft were being serviced and prepared for combat missions. They hit the ammunition storage areas where glide bombs and air-to-ground missiles were being stockpiled. In other words, Ukraine didn't just damage an airfield. They targeted the entire operational spine of Russian air power in the eastern sector of the conflict. The infrastructure that would have made a renewed air offensive possible